So let's look at carrying capacity and what that actually is. The question is, why do populations start out exponential but then begin to level off at some hypothetical carrying capacity? It's helpful to think about it in a closed system like this jar. Let's say we have a jar and we put in some fruit flies, and here's the food at the bottom of the jar. There's only so much space and food and resources available in the jar. So as these flies begin to replicate, they're eventually going to run out of space and of food. And so will they start to reproduce more slowly, or is it because more of them are dying because they're starving, or is it because more of the babies are dying because they're starving? Either way, they're going to stop replicating as resources get scarce. So let's go back to that figure that we had before and look at it again. So let's use our analogy of the jar. If this whole area up to the carrying capacity is the capacity of our jar, then we can call this sort of our room to grow. So that's how much room we have to grow. And so you can see here, down here at the very bottom, how much room do we have to grow? Well, we have the full 100%. And so we're going to be growing at 100% of our rate. But as we start to climb, let's look at like the halfway point here, right in the middle. At this halfway point, how much room left do we have to grow? In other words, how many resources do we still have left? So at this point, we only have about 50% of our resources. And so our growth rate, which includes both birth and death, is going to be about 50% of what it could be at the total capacity. And then let's say we get up to here at the 90% mark. Well, now we only have 10% left room to grow, 10% of the resources, 10% of the space. And so our growth rate will drop down to 10%. And eventually, as we reach this carrying capacity, that growth rate will drop to 0. And it's important to remember that the growth rate is both births and deaths. And so as we reach that carrying capacity and food begins to run out, resources, space, we're going to have that growth rate that'll slow down to 0. So that brings us to another good question. What about the human population? Is there a carrying capacity? So figuring out a carrying capacity is actually really difficult to do. Normally in nature, we just go out and look and see where the population is sort of hovering over time. You can try to simulate it based on resources and available space and things like that. And so for the human population, lots of people have tried to make estimates. Most of the estimates fall somewhere between 4 and 16 billion as a carrying capacity. Currently, as of 2022, we are sitting at 8 billion. So are we close to the carrying capacity? Are we over? It's really hard to know. But you can look at growth rates and see if we've started to taper off or if we are still going up exponentially, because for the measurable time of human existence, we have always been growing at a fairly exponential rate. I looked up some statistics coming out of the World Health Organization in their report about world population prospects as of 2022. One of the graphs that was really interesting was this one. So it's looking at global population sizes and annual growth rates. So you can see from 1950 to 2020, the growth rate in the world has fluctuated up and down, but it appears to be decreasing down to somewhere between 0.5 and 1.0. And so you can see that the number of people in the population is steadily increasing because we're still reproducing more than deaths are occurring, but the growth rate is slowing down. Another really interesting graph is looking at it by region. So this is looking at total fertility rates by region of the world. So you can see the world is in black, and this little dotted line here is the replacement fertility. So we're going to replace everybody that dies, or replace ourselves, right? You would want to be at 2.0. So 2 people get together and they have 2 children, they would totally replace each other. And you can see that the world is gradually declining in the amount of growth. And this is projections beyond 2022. And so you can see we're kind of getting to the point where we're barely replacing each other, which would put us at a 0 growth rate. So as we're leveling off, and you can see in some places in the world, like Europe and North America, that we've actually dropped below the replacement rate in our growth rate. And so we're actually declining population. Same thing with Australia and New Zealand, and some places, especially in Europe, that we're beginning to decline. There are other areas in like sub-Saharan Africa that are still very much above the replacement fertility. So it's really hard to know because we can't predict the future very well, but it's hard to know if our population rates are slowing, and there's a lot of things we have to think about as to why our population rates might be slowing. So if we're looking at carrying capacity as a possibility, like a limit of resources, one of the things that we really talk about is disease, so crowd diseases. So as the population becomes more densely packed, diseases tend to spread more frequently. We saw this especially with COVID. And one of the things that's actually increasing that is our increased globalization and ability to travel. So again, you saw this with COVID, that COVID could jump from continent to continent very quickly because of how quickly we move around. Another thing that we're seeing increasingly is an increased resistance to treatments, so like antibiotic resistance, that's going to cause diseases to spread more frequently and potentially be more lethal. Another thing that we might pay attention to is cultural norms. So we're seeing that in general, in developed worlds, people are waiting to reproduce, they're having fewer children, and that's bringing that population rate down. So do we have a carrying capacity? Well, probably, but where are we in relation to it? I'm not sure. But one of the things that can give us some hope is that as we develop new technologies and as we change our consumption habits, we can actually reduce our footprint, and we can actually manipulate or change the carrying capacity to be higher. The less resources each individual uses, the higher our carrying capacity can be. So just interesting to think about carrying capacity.